Welsh coming on and conducting the next interview. So I will go off stage left. Take care.
Thanks so much, Colum. We are going to carry on with the UN theme. I'm pleased to welcome to the stage with me Ambassador Cindy McCain, who is the U.S. Ambassador to the UN Agencies for Food and Agriculture. Welcome, Ambassador. Can we get another mic up here on the stage? Oh, okay. Thank you. There you go. Sorry about that. Welcome.
Thank you.
It's great to see you in person.
Thank you.
Last time we spoke, we talked a lot about what the U.S. is doing to encourage other donors to step up in the midst of the food crisis. So obviously that's a big part of UNGA, is all of the behind the scenes work. What has this week been like for you? You know, what are you telling the folks that you're meeting with to encourage them to donate to this crisis?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me today. And like all of you, I think we're in the realization now that this particular topic of food security and food availability is front and center. It's absolutely on everyone's minds. It's on the news nightly. It's in the newspapers daily. So that's a good thing. We're in a perfect storm. However, this is not going to last. So we need to strike while it's hot. My meetings, to answer your question, my meetings here have been all about how can we help, you know, and if they were in need of help, can you help me? So it's not that countries aren't willing to help at all. It's that we need more. And I'll pick a little. I won't pick on them, but I'll rat them out a little bit. The Middle East could do more, quite frankly. They have not done enough, and a lot of this stuff that's occurring right now is in their backyard. So I'd like to see the Middle East step up to the plate a little more. And I'd also like to see some of our Asian countries step up a little more also. But listen, we're in a time of crisis. And as always, the United States of America is leading the way. We are the largest donor by far to any of the UN agencies. And the folks on the ground are doing an amazing job, but we just need more.
That's always the case, isn't it? And of course, a theme, you know, here at the Devex event, as well as just UNGA in general, is sort of this, you said it yourself, perfect storm in this confluence of COVID, conflict. It's all coming together at, obviously, not that there's an opportune time.
Well, I'm going to add one more word to that too, and that's corruption. And those of you who have been on the ground or that you deal in these issues every day, you do know that corruption is a large part of the lack of food. In many countries, it either gets siphoned off, the money gets siphoned off, especially food and water. I'll use that also. So that's a whole. I add my other seed, all of this.
And from a diplomatic perspective, I mean, what can a country like the United States to incentivize governments where perhaps corruption is unfortunately the norm to change their practices?
If I had that answer, then I have that huge penthouse down there. It's more in incentivizing them to do good. And also, and I'm not above using shaming them for not. And for I'll use a perfect example for this, Madagascar. I was there not long ago, and it's a terribly poor country, and especially the south, which is where I was. It has no water, it has no agricultural aspects at all in it. It's just people kind of waiting around to die, quite frankly. And I was told there was this pipeline that was this great pipeline that's going to bring water, and it is bringing water, and oh, things are all green and happy. And I didn't see any evidence of it. And so when I went back up from a meeting with the president, I asked him about this pipeline. He said, oh, this pipeline is flowing freely. We've got great water. It was a total lie. I mean, he just lied to my face about a pipeline for water. Wow. So I use that to say that there, in many cases, and I'm not trying to point out, it's just Madagascar, it's not. But we have to call him out for that. And we have to call him out for not doing the right thing, especially when we have money in the game.
And, you know, I feel like we heard it a little bit in the last conversation, talk about multilateralism, the future of that. And I also think we've been hearing a lot about the U.S. diplomatic power. Obviously, during the last U.S. administration, a lot of positions were changed. Folks, I'm sure, have opinions about whether that was for the good or the bad. But what do you say to people that, think the U.S. power internationally is diminished and, you are no longer able to, incentivize countries to give or do this or do that or whatever?
Well, I think we are well on the road back from obviously a State Department and what the activities that the government was involved in. We're well on the way back because people are beginning to listen to us more. And I'm talking about a lot of the developing countries because that's really who I deal with. I also know that in the scheme of things as we go, that if we do, let me back up for a second. The United States gives the amount of money the United States gives to the UN system and to particularly WFP and some of the other ones is larger than the rest of the world combined. So that tells you where we're at and what we believe in and how we act. And I will never discount any State Department worker or any field worker in any way for not doing a fabulous job, because they do. And so I think it's just been a matter of really just showing our pride again and making sure that people realize that we're back in a major way.
And do you feel like that message is being received here this week in New York?
I do. I think so. I think the president's done a remarkable job in explaining what's going on, not only explaining what's going on, but explaining the needs that we're in and the situation that we're in, especially with food and agriculture.
And, you mentioned that you were traveling recently. You're obviously out in the field quite a bit, although based in Rome. What do you hear most often from people on the ground? It's obviously clear when you're there, you're representing the United States. What are people asking you for?
Humanity. They're asking for not only just food, the basic needs, food and water, but they're asking for humanity. We're in a terribly dire situation, not only in Ukraine. We cannot forget the rest of the world. I mean, Ukraine is kind of the shiny object right now because of what's going on. But we have countries right now, 4 or 5 countries, that are literally on the brink of famine. That's more than serious. It's grave. And so when I see this and when I talk to people and when I travel, I can't look past the children's faces. And I really mean this. I'm not being sappy about it. That's what I see when I go to work in the morning and continue to work on these issues, because if we don't help, then who will? So for the United States of America, we're such a great country. We're so good at what we do and we believe in what we do. And humanity is a large part of that.
You mentioned Ukraine. The last time you and I spoke, we were on the cusp of reaching a deal to get the grain out of Ukraine. That deal, of course, was reached. We've seen several tanker ships out of Ukraine, very carefully orchestrated deal. Some of those are, of course, going to Western countries. It's a commercial enterprise. People who are paying for it are getting it, obviously. But WFP has also had ships come out. The first one went to Djibouti. We've had a ship go to Yemen as well. What is the U.S. doing to ensure that that deal carries on in full force? We've obviously heard some rumblings that some players might want to blow it up.
I think there's a lot of players that would like to blow it up, but I also know that with obviously the UN and Turkey being involved, I think we can salvage it. I really do. I hope we can, and I hope that the players that are involved in this see that for what it is. We can't, this year's bad, and I know you all know this, this year's bad for food and for agriculture. Next year is going to be devastating just because of the lack of it and the inability to plant. 70% of the agricultural fields in Ukraine are mined. So, and the equipment's mined and the silos are mined. So it makes it very difficult to plant when you can't, if you risk your life doing it.
Yeah, and there's a bit of an information, well, so many different information wars, but with Russia essentially telling countries, particularly in Africa, that it's the United States' fault, it's Western sanctions' fault, that they're going hungry. Obviously, you are countering that message. Do you think that's effective? I mean, are countries understanding what the U.S. is saying?
Countries are understanding what we're saying, but let me say this Russian misinformation that's being passed around is dangerous because I'm seeing some softening on some of our major friends also on this issue. As we all know, it is not our fault. The sanctions, didn't happen because of sanctions or anything else. The easiest way to fix this is for the Russians to pull out, bottom line. So there isn't a way, any other way, and anyone that tries to tell us, meaning us, the United States, that it's somehow our fault or anything else, we just push back hard, and we'll continue to do that.
All right, now I am pleased to welcome to the stage to join us. We're going to have a bit of a progressive panel situation happening here. Alvaro Lario, who is the incoming president of the International Fund for Agricultural Development, one of the Rome-based agencies to which Ambassador McCain liaises in Rome. And so we're going to shift the conversation now a little bit to, talking about the role that the U.S. plays in Rome with the RBA. So welcome to the stage, Alvaro.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be today with all of you. Well, I would say that my pleasure is also to have Ambassador McCain in Rome. I mean, she has been really fantastic in putting all the issues related to food on the table to make Rome the food hub, I would say. Obviously, we have the 3 UN agencies, but then since she's on board, she clearly has also brought that to the next level. And what I really appreciate is that we are also discussing not only the short-term response and the humanitarian response, but actually there has been an emphasis also on the medium term. So if we do not want to drift from crisis to crisis, to have to pay up once more in 5 years, the same type of crisis, what we actually need to change is how food systems are actually funded, how food systems are actually established. So that has been a message that we have really appreciated. In addition to that, I would say the US leadership in terms of the financial response and also in the coordination. Also US Treasury through their IFAD action plan, which we have also been part. So I would say not only from the funding side, but also from the thought leadership side.
And I love that you brought in sort of the longer term resilience building. We obviously just were talking about your time in the field, lots of emergencies happening right now. But talk a little bit about Ambassador McCain, how you are working with the organizations in Rome to not forget about everything else that's going on right now.
Yes, that has been, as I mentioned earlier, that's one of our key points that we make, and certainly we have this great voice over here shouting it loud and clear, but we cannot forget the rest of the world. As I mentioned, the other countries are on the brink of famine. We have to continue to keep our eye on the ball, and that is obviously short-term emergency, as was stated, but our long-term, medium and long-term goals as well to keep sustainable food flowing.
Did you want to add something to that?
Well, that I'm an optimist. I mean, I think in development you have to be an optimist. So what I'm seeing at least this week is that awareness, the awareness that actually food security in many cases, and indeed in my meetings with some heads of state, African heads of state, it's becoming a national security issue. Actually, the self-reliance, the need of looking at local production, both of food, fertilizers. We're talking about how to get fertilizers out right now, but what is not as known is that actually there's a lot of fertilizers that are being produced in Africa. What happens, most of them, more than 80%, are being exported. So it needs to be also, we have to think about the whole architecture. How does it work? How can we focus on local production, both of food as well as fertilizers?
And Ambassador McCain, we talked about the messages you're hearing when you're traveling. What messages are you hearing from IFAD, from WFP, from FAO in Rome in terms of what they need to be responding to not only the crisis, but doing the resilience building work?
Well, the three agencies and our office there as well, we work very closely together on all of these issues and coordinate, I think, rather well together. But with that said, we always need more money. I mean, that's bottom line. I know IFAD does and the rest of the other agencies as well. And also, we need to remind people, you raise a really good point about it's a national security item. It is definitely a national security item when it comes to the United States. We have migrants coming across the southern border. They're not doing anything wrong. They're hungry, and they need a better life. So it is a national security issue when we can't seem to fix that as well. And so I feel very strongly about that, and we've managed to raise that at many of our defense conferences lately as well.
And why do you think it's so hard for that message to get through in the U.S.? You know, that's been an argument that's made on the Hill, particularly with the Republican Party. You know, sometimes there are folks that are skeptical of development aid, of the humanitarian budget, and you know, the national security argument can break through, but it doesn't always.
Well, I mean, I describe myself as a heinous chihuahua, because all I do is bark and bite, and finally to get me off their heels, they'll listen to me and then leave the room. So at least I get the message out. But it's really important that we continue on this message. We continue, even the naysayers on the Hill. We have to continue with this because it does affect the middle states. It does affect both borders, obviously, and it affects us internationally because of the lack of food and our inability. And we're going to get caught up in this a little bit too. So it's everybody's issue, and so our job, and my job particularly in the United States, is to make sure people keep hearing that and understand it.
And Alvaro, from the more international perspective, you know, do you feel like that's something? You mentioned African countries are starting to see it as a national security issue, but what about other Western countries, other donor countries?
So I would say that there's a focus right now on looking at the entire food system approach. So it's very clear that there are links to the degradation of nature we're seeing. There are links to the climate shocks that actually we're seeing. There's a link to the healthy diets. In our case, we focus very much on the small-scale producers, last 10 mile, the rural poor, which actually 80% of them live in rural areas. And what we are really seeing there is a lot of inequality, and that they are also not getting the fair share value of the entire value chain. So also that's linked to decent living wages. So there's a number of issues that go beyond local production.
I also wanted to ask about the UN Food System Summit. We're now a year out from that event that was held mostly virtually, unfortunately, last year here in New York. And sort of mixed reviews on the outcomes from that. Obviously, no one at that time a year ago saw the war in Ukraine coming, just like we didn't see COVID coming. Obviously, this is sort of becoming the pattern. We just have crisis after crisis. So how, first of all, your reflections on that event, but also how you take the relationships that were created there and, build an infrastructure that can quickly respond to these crises. Alvaro, we'll go to you first on that one.
So I would say there's a good coalition of doers that are willing, and there's a number of platforms. The most positive side that I believe reflecting that was the outcome, because I would say we have the institutions, we know what needs to be done. Sometimes it's just the political will, or it's also the financing. But I think the most positive side from us and how to coordinate is that now we speak a common language. So the common language is the national pathways. It's very clear that many of these countries, at least in our country programs and other institutions, when we want to coordinate, we need to make sure that we cater to the needs of the countries. And this is done through a policy dialogue, but at the country level, so that we all speak the same language, where it's WHO, WFP, ourselves. When we speak to the countries, we see how can we actually add to their national pathways. I think that's one of the positive side. We do it in our country programs, and we need to include the people, because actually those are the ones who know the needs. In our case, we work with the farmers organizations. We really make sure that they're being listened at that in the design and the national pathways. We are catering to their needs, the ones who actually know it.
And Ambassador McCain, from your perspective in Rome, how are you working with the agencies to advance the work of the UN Food System Summit?
Well, primarily, we encourage them to, if possible, work together on these issues, share information. Data is very important, and also breaking down the silos. And that is not always, IFAD is not, I'm not including IFAD in that at all, but I am going to include some of the other agencies in that. We need to break down the silos and work in a better way together. Because in many cases, and I've seen it, you probably have seen it too, there's a lot of duplication where we could actually do more with less and be able to spread it out a little more. So that's where I would do it.
And I think in this moment of crisis too, everyone can kind of panic and forget to coordinate, but you do have, 3 separate agencies that do have 3 separate mandates. So, how do you ensure everyone stays in their lane?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, it's when let's start with Ukraine, okay? It's an emergency situation, a little bit different than the long-term things, but it's an emergency situation. They should be coordinated and they should be talking to each other so that it, again, it's not duplicated and there can be more of it too, because each part, FAO has an emergency response portion to it. So perhaps it just makes better sense to me, and I think it's better use of our dollar too.
Yeah, that's important. Alvaro?
Yeah, so I think we do really need to coordinate well in terms of the policy. Obviously, the mandates, one is emergency, the other one is normative, the other one is more on the investment, ours is on the investment side. But I think on the policy side, we need to make sure that we work actually with the countries. And sometimes there's opportunities to work together. I think Ambassador McCain was in Guatemala and Honduras, and there we have a program of school meals where actually the 3 of us work together with local production. It's working very well. Those are the projects that we need to escalate to make sure that we can also work in other parts of the world.
All righty. Well, thank you so much, Ambassador McCain. Thanks for participating in our interview and this progressive panel. Ambassador McCain is now going to leave us, and I'm going to carry on our conversation with Alvaro. So you are here at UNGA representing IFAD, although you are not yet the president. You are the president-elect, I believe, October 1st, yes?
That's correct.
All right. Tell us a little bit about your priorities for the agency. As we've already heard, moment of crisis, tons of things going on. You're stepping into a really important role. What are you focusing on first?
So I would say my first focus is impact. And when we talk about impact, we really need to quantify, to measure, and to make sure that we know what we are talking about. For us, it's important not just to do single projects, but actually to transform the communities with whom we work. We just finalized our impact assessment, which we do over 15% of our projects. And we have shown that we have impacted the lives of 77 million of people, raising their income by at least 10%, people who are many times on the brink of poverty. 64 million people have better access to market. 38 million people have increased their resilience by at least 20% through surveys we do ex post and ex ante. That's an impact. And I think we need to quantify and make sure that we know what we are talking about. The second priority is obviously mobilizing finance. We became the first UN fund to actually get a credit rating. And that has enabled us, for example, this June to actually mobilize money from Japanese pension funds, Swedish pension funds, but that's not enough. We need to continue thinking on ways of innovatively creating structures, financing mechanisms, platforms to attract that money. Climate adaptation is a big priority. For example, we have been increasing our pipeline with the Green Climate Fund. Many of the last projects have been really catering to small-scale producers through IFAD, and I think that's also very important, how to mobilize funds. And on the third part of mobilizing funds, I'm being very frank, we are seeing that there was, for example, on the African continent, the Malabo Declaration in 2014, whereby all of the countries committed to invest 10% of their GDP in agriculture. That has not happened. There has been one who is close, all of the rest not. And not only on the African continent, I would see it on many others. Indeed, agriculture is 2 to 3 times more effective in order to reduce and tackle poverty. So it's a sector that actually can reduce poverty, and in many cases, it's a source of jobs. So I think mobilizing money is the second one. And third, I would say, even though we work in rural areas, we cater especially to small-scale producers, what we're seeing is that before there was a conversation on climate and there was a conversation on food. Now they have totally converged. The climate-food nexus is extremely clear. When I talk to many of the heads of state recently, they are asking us for climate adaptation financing. And when we talk about climate adaptation financing, once more, it seems a big name. Well, let me tell you what that means in rural areas and for agriculture. So it can be something very simple, planting trees in order to create shades for cocoa, coffee crops. It can be something much more complicated, conserving or restoring wetlands in order to conserve soil, water, and that increases yields massively. So yeah, there's a number, I think, of important priorities.
No, nothing going on. You mentioned a couple of things that I want to dig into further. The first is the financing piece, of course. I wrote about the bond issuances that happened a couple of months ago. Talk a little bit more about why that was necessary for the fund. Why are you dipping into that new kind of financing?
So I think we need to evolve to the modern times. We're listening to Mr. Steiner, and I think we need to really make sure that we create the platforms and the mechanisms that we don't only talk about them. So IFAD for 40 years was lending mainly, and we do concessional loans, grants, mostly to low-income countries, and we do it through public loans, but that clearly is not enough nowadays. So we have been starting also a private sector window. We have been financing projects. We need to make sure that now we are mainstreaming it and also using it with our public sector loans. We already do a lot with the private sector, public-private partnerships. We call them 4Ps, public-private producer partnerships. But we need to make sure that we are creating new mechanisms. It's not enough to work like we were working 40 years ago. So I think connecting the global savings, my background is also a financial background. I think it's very important that we manage to connect the big trillions, the billions that we're discussing into this type of development.
And do you expect more bond issuances to be coming in the near future? I mean, how big of the portfolio do you anticipate that will become?
So currently we're expecting approximately 1.2 billion every cycle. So yeah, I think it's not going to be a one-off
cycle.
3 years. So 400 million per year. And when we were talking before about debt, then we talk about the challenges that actually debt, because what we're seeing is that many of the low-income countries, 60% of them are in high debt distress. That means that they cannot take any more loans, even if they are extremely concessional loans. The loans they take from us can be 0.75%, 1%, 1.5%. When they go to the markets or access bilateral loans from, let's say, from different parts of the world, you can imagine that we could be talking about 8-10% interest rate. So that makes a huge difference. But they have such amounts of debt that currently they cannot get more debt. So there's a conundrum there that we were discussing that links to the global financial architecture that might need to be rediscussed. We're talking about debt relief. There's many things that we might need to put on the table. SDR, I don't know how familiar you are with the IMF rechanneling. That has not worked yet. We would like it to go also to food security, not only health and climate. We think there's a crisis in food security. We urge also to look at possibilities of rechanneling SDR into food security, but we need more money. We're talking in the case of climate adaptation about 300 billion for developing economies per year by 2050. These are massive amounts. We need to be creative. We have done it in the past. We need to do it now.
And are those direct conversations you're having with the IMF?
We have, yeah. We started some time ago. Obviously, Kristalina has been doing a fantastic job, pushing many times. It's also for the donor countries, for the member countries also to perhaps see how we can make it happen.
We'll stay tuned on that. I also want to talk about the climate piece. We've got just a couple of minutes left. You mentioned that, of course, as one of your big priorities, and I think you are right. I think that is one of the pros that came out of the UN Food Systems Summit, as we were talking about, is this relationship between the two sectors and understanding one is not going to succeed in their agenda without the other. Lots happening around COP this year, recognition of agriculture formally on the agenda. Tell us about how you want to push this forward.
So I think we need to find ways to finance it first, and also because what I'm listening from the recipients for the heads of state ministers is that they are suffering more and more. We need to find ways, where it's through water capture, drop the resiliency, it's giving small loans to farmers to actually be able to adapt irrigation systems. We need to find ways to actually, for them to adapt. And when we talk about climate adaptation, it's actually to really continue with their living, not to lose their assets, not to lose the biodiversity. So we need to make sure that we are enabling them to finance and to have a living, and to have a decent living, because otherwise, I mean, the consequence, and I was speaking to the president of Niger, is they have right now, most of their population, they don't even count it under 18, they count it under 15. So imagine if we do not create opportunities for those people, what's going to happen? Not very difficult. Migration, many times it's not even to Europe, to the neighboring countries. Terrorism. So there's not much that we have as an option. I mean, we really need to invest.
And will IFAD be engaging directly at COP?
Yeah, we will be present. We welcome you. And indeed, we will be working also with the government in Egypt. They have named us as the lead in the food pillar. And currently we are mobilizing a number of billions that we will be announcing to make sure. And part of it obviously will be also linked to climate adaptation, which is becoming more and more key, at least for the rural poor.
And on the climate adaptation piece, obviously that looks different in different regions of the world, and we've heard this morning about what's happening in Pakistan, and that's, we can add another thing to the list of something no one was expecting, and now all of a sudden we are responding to. What are some parts of the world that concern you, particularly when it comes to climate adaptation, that are really, really tough to solve?
So I would say climate change is a global phenomenon, but the impact is very much local. For example, you were mentioning the Pakistan floods. The first consequence is that the neighboring countries have started with restrictions on exports and bans, for example, on rice. And that means that, being Pakistan the fourth rice producer, it has consequences then on other parts also of Africa. So it has a spillover effect in all of the neighboring countries. So clearly that's one of the issues. But we have seen extreme situations this last year. In Somalia has been horrible, and we have seen also the migration associated, the Horn of Africa. So this is not a one-off. I mean, this is going to continue. It's affecting us also in the developed world, but obviously we have other mechanisms to cope, both with the food as well with the weather. Many of these populations are in the brink of poverty, so this just makes them fall into poverty.
Alrighty, well, we are at time. Alvaro, thank you so much for joining us. It was such a privilege to be able to speak with you as you are embarking on this new role. Obviously, very important, lots on your agenda, lots on the plate for sure. We'll be continuing to follow this at Devex. I'd love for you all to subscribe to our food systems newsletter, Devex Dish, which I write, where we will be continuing all of these conversations. Thanks so much, Alvaro.
Thank you very much.